Good afternoon. We're here in North St. Louis, and I'm here with the Michael Allen of the Preservation Research Office, very well-known figure in St. Louis, very vocal voice for historic preservation, urbanism, etc. How you doing, Mike?
Doing well.
Yeah, and I've known Mike for quite some time, involved in other pursuits. Now
we go back a little way.
Go back a little way. Yeah. So, briefly explain to me the building that's behind us, which was behind us.
All right. So we're standing right in front of, or well, behind a house at 1936 St. Louis Avenue. This was a townhouse built by Bernard Winkleman, one of the many kind of nouveau riche German-American millionaires that made their fortunes in the early 19th century. So he built the place in 1873. Beautiful stone front, amazing house, stood for many years. When Winkleman and his compatriots moved out of this neighborhood to get away from the poor masses moving in around downtown, it became a funeral home. And it was used as a funeral home from the 1920s until 2005 when Paul McKee's company bought it. And eventually McKee came out as Northside Regeneration. In 2009 he finally gave a plan to the city. He gave a list of buildings to be saved that he absolutely promised preservationists like myself he was going to protect. This was one of them. But by 2009, brick thieves had already taken down part of the back. But it was still a savable building. I have a photo of it taken last year, about a year ago. It was in pretty good shape. You could have done something with it. All of a sudden, in the last year, massive collapsing, and then a couple of months ago, McKee started demolishing it. So here it stands. It stands because a bunch of us were opposed to the demolition. We heard it was getting torn down. It was on the list. I actually went to Eddie Roth, the public safety director, and he's gotten the situation a little bit stalled to find some time to figure out how to save it, but, you know, it's a long shot.
And this is a story of one building, which is kind of, in some ways, a story of the whole neighborhood. And briefly, these buildings were built in the late 19th century, right?
Right.
This is when this neighborhood really began to be populated?
Yeah, this neighborhood was first laid out in 1850 here in St. Louis Place, and construction was in full swing 1870s through the 1890s. It really grew to be, you know, probably the most fashionable neighborhood for German American middle and upper class.
And when did that begin to change?
That changed, gosh, you know, almost as soon as the neighborhood was finished. Mm-hmm. By the time the turn of the century hit, new subdivisions were already being developed in areas like O'Fallon Park and Penrose Park. And what we see in that area, subdivisions like Plymouth Park, which is Athlone and Holly Place, laid out in 1906, they offered something this neighborhood didn't have: severe deed restrictions that limited the presence of commercial development, restricted the housing rights to only white, and mandated certain construction costs, essentially building an elite enclave. So nobody could even afford to build a house in there unless they had some money. And the houses all had to be set back from the street, so the suburbs were starting to go. So white flight started, you know, by 1910, people were flying out of St. Louis Place to hit O'Fallon Park and other more fashionable, all-white, all-middle and upper-class neighborhoods. That's a trend that continues today.
Continues today. Now, I like to say there's three different factions in this neighborhood, in this area. Now, we'll get to the third faction first, but I want to stay in history. There's a kind of grizzled, old, white, blue-collar population.
Right.
Yeah.
Winkleman and his friends could afford to move out, but a lot of people couldn't. And their second, third, fourth, fifth generations are still around.
And you'll frequently see them sitting on porch stoops, drinking Anheuser-Busch products and the like. Right. You know, walking through the neighborhood. And the second group is the African American population. Tell me about the history of the two populations briefly. This blue collar white population, and it has its root in that time period.
Right. Yeah. They working class people moved in these neighborhoods around downtown before anyone had enough money to build a house like the one we're standing next to. They came in to work jobs on the North Riverfront, and later on industry came into this neighborhood. Columbia Brewery, later Falstaff, got built. 20th and Madison. They had a big box plant. There were iron works. There were chemical companies. There were all kinds of places to make things all over the neighborhood.
And the neighborhood bars and churches.
Yeah, the whole network that would go with it.
That would go with that, yeah.
A lot of the workers in this neighborhood would have gotten to work on foot or a short streetcar ride.
And of course, my grandparents grew up in this neighborhood. My grandmother used to walk to a Crown Candy and lived in this area for decades. And I think as a part of that population, my grandfather was a pipe fitter. They ended up moving out to North County, and you see that beginning to move to North County, I guess, what, in the 50s, would you say?
Yep, right in the 1950s.
And mostly predicated on a white flight, from my understanding. And then since the 80s and 90s, that population from North County moving out to St. Charles County and Lincoln counties.
Right, and they pull all the institutions with them.
They pull all the institutions with them. As an example, my grandmother's church is Bell Fountain Baptist Church. They used to have several hundred people would attend on Sunday. It's a beautiful building. They have a lot of money, actually, because they invested in money wisely over the years. If you go there, it's an old white church, Southern Baptist Church. You go there on Sundays now, there's about 10 or 15 elderly people and one young family at the church. And there are churches like that have closed all throughout North County, businesses. Peroni's Pizza just opened out in St. Charles County. Right. Ponticello's is for sale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, everything that happened to St. Louis Place in the 1920s
is happening out there.
Happened to O'Fallon Park in the 1950s.
And Baden's in the 70s and 80s. Yeah.
Right now. It's all shifting.
Okay, so then you have the African American population. When did African Americans begin to arrive in this section of North St. Louis in big numbers?
Oh, they didn't. African Americans didn't come to St. Louis Place until after 1950. Until 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer that housing deed restrictions couldn't be enforced by the courts, most of this area was protected through the use of restrictive covenants. Okay. Real estate.
That was most of North St. Louis.
Most of North St. Louis. Cass Avenue was the northern line in this area for the St. Louis Metropolitan Real Estate Exchange racist map. I mean, they had a map of the city named 1923, and they didn't extend anywhere north of Cass until the late 40s, and that was west of Jefferson. So this area really didn't open up until Shelley versus Kramer. And then Interstate Highway 70 was built starting 54. Once they started clearing blocks for the highway,
my great-grandparents' house,
sell their house and get out.
Yeah.
And African Americans were being pushed out at that time from DeSoto Carr, which was being completely demolished for Pruitt-Igoe, 25 blocks. Then right after that, from 59 to 65, Mill Creek Valley. So a lot of those people, they moved their households into St. Louis Place and Old North because there's cheap, large, spacious housing available. And there still were jobs left at that point.
Right. And my great-grandparents were on Branch, and it was toward the highway wanted the house.
Right.
They moved out to Moline Acres in North County. And to give you an example, I got a picture of the Riverview Gardens class of 1970. There's one African American in the class of 1970, and today, of course, it's 99.9% African American in Riverview. That just shows you the population flight. Okay, so then there becomes a time that I remember well that this area, particularly where I'm living, 1400 block of North Market, around that area, becomes known to be very seedy. Right. People don't even want to drive through the neighborhood. People will avoid the neighborhood at all costs. This is starting, what, say the 70s?
70s, yeah. I mean, it's 70s and into the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, really, up until a couple of years ago.
Right. I mean, even now there's still some crime issues, but it's not like other places I have lived, which are much worse. But the perception still is out there, definitely. And at that point, with crime increasing, then you have working people, middle class people, black and white, trying to get out of the neighborhood.
Right.
Right. Right. And some of them even just leaving their houses.
Yeah.
They can't sell them.
Right.
Just abandoning their property.
Right. Nobody wants to buy them.
And then it comes in
sometimes the insurance money is all you get, so you burn your house. There's a lot of arsons in the 60s and 70s up here, or abandonment. And the city takes it over.
And the brick and copper thieves come.
Yep.
Taking
and brick stuff's been going on since the 70s. It's nothing new. It's happened in this area for a long, long time. 60 to 65% of the recorded building stock that existed in St. Louis Place and Old North as of 1960 was gone by 2010. So in 50 years, over half the buildings gone. But over half the people went too. So it's only logical.
Right. Well, like I say about the area around here is you never have to worry about finding a place to park.
Nope. Nope. Place to run the dog.
Right.
It's all here.
Plenty of space. It almost feels like you're living in a rural area on the edge of a city at times.
It really does. Yeah. I think that's, there's this kind of, simultaneous sort of dynamic. You lose the buildings, the land opens up. So people who want that kind of urban lifestyle where they have places to walk to and there are lots of things to do don't want to come in here. Even when this neighborhood is getting safer because
there's nowhere to go to.
The emptier it gets, the safer it gets too.
Right.
But there's nowhere to go to and there's not the kind of character left. So people who do stick around and do come in tend to be hardier pioneer types who don't mind living in the frontier,
So now this brings us to the third population neighborhood. Is a young, I would say urbanist.
Yeah.
And it's a little different than what you'll find in the South Side and Benton Park and those areas, to my experience. It's a little more hardcore because, they're in an area, while it's not as safe, it's still, a lot of danger in the area. If you don't believe me, I was sitting in my living room when the election results came in and just heard massive amounts of gunfire going off when Obama was announced his victory. And a couple months before that, the guy was placed on the hood of my car and robbed on the hood of my car. So things happen, But you tend to have, I would see a little more historically minded people moving into the area, a little more people, like that. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. You have people who are really so, they value the architectural history of this area and the cultural history so much that they're willing to live here even with 65% of the building stock gone. They want to restore a house and they want to live in a historic neighborhood, and the fact that it's in the condition it's in isn't a huge deterrent. And there's some other cultural differences, I think. You have people up here more willing to do their own work, so people doing the whole do-it-yourself kind of rehabber that typified Soulard and Lafayette Square in the 70s and 80s. You don't find those people so much in Southside neighborhoods like Benton Park and Tower Grove East. Those people are up here getting their hands dirty. Also, a really interesting thing, and I'm not a sociologist, but I won't speculate, but I do notice there are communities of faith that have kind of become part of the pioneers here. The whole movement in the late 70s and early 80s to save the neighborhood was led by a group of 30 families from Grace and Peace Presbyterian, liberal Christians. They came up here. They were the people who started the Old North St. Louis Restoration Group with some longtime residents who were still around. Those families, a lot of them are still here 30 years on. Their rehabs are done. Some of them second generation. Actually, they're still up here. I sold my house when I owned it. I was here for 4 years. I sold it to the child of one of these early families, and he's lived his whole life now in Old North St. Louis and become a homeowner. And then in St. Louis Place, in some parts of Old North, you have the Catholic workers. So talk about liberal Christians. I mean, it's a huge community.
Sunshine Ministries, other faith groups.
And so you don't really see that in the white kind of urban pioneers on the south side. Tend to be. You
also see it with New City Fellowship. Over there, like on the west side, off Hodemont and Hamilton and what we would call the west side. But I guess those neighborhoods. That church has made an effort to have its members move into that area.
Right. Maybe it takes a lot of faith to believe in the north side, but
it takes a lot of faith.
It's interesting that these communities are here and they're strong and they persist. The Catholic workers have been here since the early 70s. They once had the Clemens House down Cass Avenue. Now they're over at Cairn House, part of the St. Laborious Parish Complex. And I mean, these are people who are willing to take on extremely difficult buildings, difficult blocks, and they grow their communities organically. I mean, it's really amazing.
And I got 3 Somali families on my block now,
Oh,
which is a new
wow.
addition
Wow.
to
Immigration into North St. Louis.
immigration in North St. Louis. You know, and I'm one of the co-founders of one of the oldest mosques in North St. Louis, on Geraldine and Harney in Walnut Park. And the Somalis keep coming to this neighborhood. You'll have the first mosque in this part of town
That'd be great.
as well. Now, I want to talk about something else, because there's a lot of things around perception and how you view the world and how others view the world. I always say that, you know, one of my favorite lines I've ever read in a book was, you know, Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. To put yourself in the other person's shoes and try to see things from their perspective. I got friends that'll come over for boxing matches, or they'll come over to my place and they'll see the new neighbors, you know, white people in the neighborhood, and they simply view it as gentrification, as white people are going to take over the neighborhood. And I tell them in this neighborhood that's not really the case, because if people don't move in, there's not going to be anybody here.
Right.
It's just going to be fields, and everything's going to be tore down. Now, you do have that kind of phenomenon in other places, but that's not existed in this part of town. But when you go to places like Brooklyn, I know you were just in New York, and I lived in New York for years, you have this phenomena that Brooklyn's becoming very expensive. And most of the people I knew when I was living there, African-American families, are now in the Carolinas, in the suburbs of Atlanta. And a lot of people just been priced out and find they just can't make it. They just can't get on their feet. You get married, there's nowhere to go. And what we were talking about earlier, you're seeing the new phenomenon of the ghetto, the inner suburb, here in North County in St. Louis, PG County in Maryland, parts of Long Island in New York. A younger affluent, maybe more secular, whatever you want to describe it, more liberal, moving in the city, and then another one going out into exurbia, St. Charles, Lincoln County. You know, like I told you, my father's from North St. Louis, out in Troy, Missouri. A ton of people he knows out there in St. Charles, Lincoln counties. What would be your response to some of those kind of critiques? That there's some class insensitivity and things of that nature involved in urbanism?
I think there definitely is. Sometimes I worry that what a lot of people call urbanism, gentrification. So that a lot of people, when they say, you know, here's where the urbanist agenda is, it's not, you know, the list rarely includes things like schools, public safety, small businesses. Often includes, you know, nightlife, entertainment, historic preservation through expensive rehab. You know, it's a laundry list of things that really make neighborhoods more expensive places to live, not necessarily qualitative. I mean, they're perfectly well-maintained neighborhoods that, you know, I hear kind of urbanist clamor, oh, something should be done there. That neighborhood, you know, has a lot of potential. When, to me, it looks like a neighborhood that's fully occupied with lots of people.
But that's one, that's
like
one.
Potential for what? Potential to be gentrified. And that's capitalism. That's almost not even a cultural value there. That's just the sheer sort of capitalist real estate market at work. Urbanism has long been wrapped up in that agenda.
That's one of the things. You know, Fulton Street in Bed-Stuy, you know, was a place that people would, American Muslims like myself, would come from around the country to go shopping in, to eat at those restaurants, and go to the mosque in the corner of Fulton and Bedford, and it was really a famous place. And if you look at hip hop coming in the '80s, it really became the cultural epicenter of hip hop. Was Bed-Stuy. And was a cultural epicenter of grassroots Muslims in America. They used to call Harlem Mecca and Bed-Stuy Medina. And where I saw beauty, some people saw blight. You see what I'm trying to say? So it's all in the perception a lot of times.
Right, and the perception is oftentimes in I think, among people who are advocates for urban planning and design, perception is way too ramped up in, you know, the built environment. You know, are there new buildings? Are there fully rehab buildings? They're not looking at the culture. They're not looking at the people. They're not looking at what's really going on when they come to a neighborhood. It might look dingy, but there might be, you know, amazing grassroots things happening right in front of their eyes, and they just are too blind to see because they're thinking, well, where are the coffee shops? Where are the bike racks?
Where's the
transit-oriented development?
Yeah,
it's like, you know, those are their own values being projected. They're also values wrapped up with that, you know, higher valuation. So, to me, you know, successful urban planning creates diversity, and foremost, it creates economic diversity. And so, you know, maybe Brooklyn to some people is a lot better than it was 20 years ago, but to others, it's a missed opportunity because 20 years ago, it was a lot more economically and racially integrated. And now, you know, the places in Brooklyn that are still affordable are a lot farther from Manhattan. They're on the ends of the train line. We don't see that happening in St. Louis yet in big numbers because we first have to get a lot of people willing to move to St. Louis.
Right, which is not happening right now. It's very slow.
We're having a lot of suburbanites come in.
Right.
Then they have their kids. Then they move right back out.
Because of the state of the public schools.
All the 30-something people, you know, the majority of my friends who came into the city, rah-rah, we're going to stick it out, have a kid, within a year, they are out of here. Or they're planning to get out.
Well,
they don't put their kids in the public school district.
My sister lives in Dogtown, and her kids are nearing their high school age. That's one of the issues she's wrestling with, is does she want to stay in the city? You know, and it's a tough call for these families. It's easy
to sympathize. I mean, there's families in all ends of the economic spectrum don't want to put their kids through the public school system in St. Louis.
Right.
And I don't blame any of them.
Right. It's a tough call, and it's one of the big things we got to fix is the public schools in the city of St. Louis.
But that means, you know, having this sort of collective consciousness that everybody who's struggling with the schools, poor, black, white, you know, Bosnian, every family is part of one district. It belongs to all of us, and we need to work together, not just figure out a way to get your family out the fastest. And I think it's the biggest problem.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems historically is you have your Southside Democrats, your white Democrats, who none of them send their kids to public school historically. Their kids are in the Catholic schools. So, I mean, you know.
Right, and then you're seeing the African American Democrats really getting behind charter schools, you know, and breaking away from their law. They used to be big supporters of public schools, and now they're all pushing this charter school agenda alongside Rex Hinkfield and others. And so, who is really advocating for the public school system anymore? It seems like everybody's just trying to abandon it.
Let's talk about public housing. We're not too far from Pruitt-Igoe, where it once stood. And I grew up on stories of Pruitt-Igoe. Heard a lot of my mother, you know, used to hang out in Pruitt-Igoe, and my younger brother and sister, their dad was from Pruitt-Igoe, and a lot of stories. I really like the documentary, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth. I will say, like I told you before, though, I've never heard a story about the Pruitt-Igoe in which Fat Woods, the gangster who ran Pruitt-Igoe, wasn't mentioned, and his Lieutenant Earl Jr. and Sam Petty, and then but what do you think is the future of public housing? You know, we look at New York, for example, like 400,000 people in public housing or something of that nature. All the project towers have been torn down except for one in St. Louis. What's the future of public housing in the city of St. Louis?
The future of public housing is really wrapped up in the larger question of where the next ghetto is. Public housing has been really, you know, traditionally, it was used to remake the core of the city. In St. Louis, Chicago, big tracts of rundown so-called slum housing around the cores of the city were cleared and rebuilt. That's because that land was not valuable to the private sector, but the private sector wanted all that was there out of the way for maybe some future in which the values would be higher. Well, that time has come. And when that time has come, we've gone after systematically every public housing project and destroyed it. You know, say what you want about high-rise versus low-rise, and that's a whole other urban planning debate, and there are people on all sides of that issue. But I guess the idea that all of a sudden all this land around the core of the city should be made available for market-rate development when these historically have been sites of poor neighborhoods is somewhat absurd. But it's definitely part of the re-gentrification of the cores of cities. And, you know, 100 years ago, Mill Creek Valley and the Pruitt-Igoe site were the discards of St. Louis's creeping concentric rings of real estate value. Oh, that's the lowest value. Go live there. Then 50 years after that, oh, well, we don't like what's going on over there. We don't like all these African Americans on the edge of downtown making businesses nervous. Oh, and by the way, they're voting. They even elected an African American alderman. Something needs to be done about that. Then you build the high-rise towers. oh wait, they're failing, let's blow them up. You know, we've done that, and now we've succeeded in pushing those populations around. I mean, yes, a lot of them have been rebuilt in these low-rise developments, but look at who's living in those low-rise developments. They're not the same people who live in the high-rise towers.
That's right, yeah.
They're different people.
Right.
And the families who are in the towers are being pushed all over. A lot of them are going to the suburbs. I read a study in Chicago. The Chicago Housing Authority has pushed out thousands of families. Most of them are in the suburbs now. They're not staying in the city limits.
That's right. You know,
it's a big demographic change, and the Hope 6 program to remake the towers, a lot of people got behind it because they thought the towers were inhumane, you know, prison-like environments. But the program's side effect has been really getting rid of the poor around downtowns and making that land safe for gentrification and real estate development. And that's really a shame. And we're also the building types. The towers, like them or not, they made you aware there were thousands of poor people living around downtown.
Right.
The new architecture is designed to blend in and make poverty invisible.
That's right. I got a friend of mine. She's in London now, but she was a social worker in D.C. And she talked about, you know, the removal of public housing in D.C., which would bring people out to PG. And a lot of them just become lost. They're totally detached from everything they grew up with, from their roots. A lot of the boys would end up getting killed because they're no longer on their territory, they're no longer where they grew up. Same thing in Kinloch. I know a lot of people from Kinloch who, not a 95, 98% Kinloch is tore down, which is something I'd like to do a documentary on. You have people just kind of floating around. They've lost their sense of place. They've lost their sense of identity.
They talk about where do you stay, where do you live.
Right.
Nobody's anywhere very long.
That's right.
And
know where the T-shirt says "I am Kinloch."
Right.
But they live in Ferguson.
Right.
They live in Hazelwood. You know.
Right.
You know. But that place that they remember no longer exists.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's going on? What happened with Pruitt-Igoe and Darslabby happened, you know, as you said, with places that were not public housing projects. Other you know, areas where there were concentrations of poor people, like Kinloch, the Ville. I mean, all these north side neighborhoods, it seems like they were only healthy, thriving places, you know, long enough for them to be completely destroyed or decimated. And so you've got all these people from Pruitt-Igoe, the Ville, Kinloch, living all over the region. You know, they're never going to go back home. Their homes are gone. So it's like a culture of refugees.
Robertson, which totally doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, it's really something else.
It's like we've succeeded in making an entire segment of the population nomadic.
Right.
And I can see, I don't want to speculate on the benefits, but I can see one thing that comes out of that is low voter registration, low voter turnout. You know, Mill Creek Valley had a black alderman. The area to the north where Pruitt-Igoe has had a black alderman. You know, there's political power in that. Whether or not the housing stock was of quality or dignified housing is another question, but politically there's something growing there, and that's all been lost.
And what you see with this transfer of population out to North County, and you can go to parts of North County now, it's completely desolate, all the retail's gone. Hit hardest by the subprime, any area in the state of Missouri. Full of an older population and young single mothers with kids. And, you know, you got the recipe for a lot of disaster.
Right. And what does the state respond?
Right.
Nothing.
What
does the state do for development? They create a new tax credit for land assemblage on the north side of St. Louis where everybody's already left.
Right.
So that's serving a developer who's claiming to remake it. Whereas the area where people actually are struggling to survive gets no such assistance, no handouts. We're putting all of our public resources behind remaking places that have already been abandoned instead of trying to stabilize places. We're never going to stabilize neighborhoods where poor people live. I think it's just never going to happen in this state.
Well, my time is running down for this interview, but live from McKeeville with Michael Allen. We're still waiting. We don't know what the plan is. We don't know what's going on. But we do see this. And there's a lot of other McKee properties that don't look that much different than this property right here, right now. Nice talking to you, Mike.
All right, good.